Welcome to this on-demand session regarding claim preparation and professional fees coverage. I'm Kevin Gruging with the Pixis Group and have been a forensic accountant in the insurance space since 1996. Today we are going to take a very deep dive into this additional coverage. This session, while it was relevant to really anybody who may stumble across this coverage in the real world, whether you're an insurance buyer or seller, it is specifically designed for the insurance broker and the various roles within. So whether you're a claim expert or on the claims team, account executive, producer, this is very relevant for all of those roles within an insurance agency. So what you can expect us to cover today is certainly a thorough explanation and purpose of the coverage, but we'll be highlighting the differences between the various forms that are out there. Language does vary, and so we're going to take a very thorough view in comparison of those examples, and then actually how you can go about using this coverage in practice. So with that being said, let's jump in. So before we get too far into the details of this session, I want to take a moment and give you a general outline of what to expect and how we've broken up some of the session. And so we'll start with a general definition and make sure we understand exactly what the coverage is and its purpose. And then we'll cover some of the benefits and why exactly anybody would want to have this coverage or would need this coverage. Then we'll shuffle into the specifics of the coverage itself and what the scope includes and what it does pay for, what's excluded, who's included, who's excluded, and get into some of those details. And then we'll come back and wrap up with some of the challenges. Like any insurance coverage, there's always components to navigate and challenges, and actually explain how to use this and leverage the coverage in practice. Like I said, the best place for us to start is to define this coverage. However, before I do that, I want to give you some guidance as to where you might find this additional coverage or the types of insurance where this additional coverage is available. And so for the context of today, most of the examples and talking points that we'll be going through are going to be from the commercial property insurance perspective. However, it's not uncommon for this additional coverage to be available in crime policies, in builder's risk forms, in cyber policies. So there are some nuances with those other types of insurance sometimes with this coverage, but I'll do my best as we go through this to highlight or identify any nuances from one type of insurance to the other. As you can imagine, there are endless forms out there, and I will say that the language and the definitions between them vary slightly. While they're all very similar, there are nuances and subtle differences between all of them. I think the reality of it is, though, you could take any of them and get this simplistic view and definition that would cover them all. That being, it's a additional coverage to allow a policyholder to get some help to prepare their claim after suffering a loss. And for us, what that usually means, or even in the insurance world, generally speaking, when we talk about quote unquote preparing a claim, that usually gets connected to a forensic accounting role, which then in turn gets connected to business interruption. And I think the reality of it is that couldn't be any further from the truth. While preparing the business interruption claim is a very significant portion of what we do, our role is actually much broader than that, and this coverage goes beyond that. So there are various aspects of a commercial property claim, but there usually is some connection to physical damage. So you're talking about building coverages, business personal property, which could include contents, but also inventory. So the claim preparation process goes well beyond just business interruption, is much broad and really applies to any portion of the claim that needs to be submitted to the carrier for reimbursement. Want to take a moment and go into the benefits of this coverage and why somebody would even want to have it in the first place in their policy. And so I think the most obvious thing for us is the concept of focusing on the recovery. Imagine a policyholder insured having suffered a significant loss if you haven't been through a claim before, it can be very burdensome, very chaotic, and there's a lot going on. And I think the concept of getting back to where you were before the loss and having a full recovery is something that you really can't outsource. So the people within the organization are the ones that need to be making decisions and talking about repairs and putting things back. They're the ones that have to focus on that. And I think what happens at the same time, though, is your partner, your insurance company, is frankly the ones that are going to be paying for it, for all the damages and the losses, in theory, depending on limitations and policy and whatnot. But they have a very significant financial interest in the parties are aligned in that regard as to getting back as quickly as possible. And what can happen in a claim is that it can become very burdensome. An insurance company needs information, and they need it pretty quick to help the policyholder. And they need to make reserves, and allowing somebody that knows what's needed is really a benefit that can help expedite things and cut to the chase and allow the policyholder to focus on putting things back. The other component is, I don't know any policyholder or insured that has somebody sitting around just waiting to put information together and data for an insurance company or to prepare a claim. And so, it usually becomes somebody else's burden. It could be a controller, CFO, or a handful of people, where they can all of a sudden be burdened with all this extra work that they frankly probably had no time for in the first place, and can really slow things down. And so a lot of that, this is a part that can be outsourced to a third party and can be delegated pretty easily. And the data and information can actually be quite burdensome, as well. And we're talking about financial information, if you're in manufacturing, production, payroll information, invoices, receipts, quotes, proposals, endless amount of information. And the larger the claim, the reality of it is the more information and documentation that's needed. And this one I think gets overlooked a little bit. You're going to have in any claim an insurance adjuster assigned by the carrier almost immediately. And that person is somebody that deals with claims every single day and probably will have been doing so for quite some time. And this is the world that they live in, claims. And they'll probably have a team, depending on the type of loss, they'll probably have a team of experts supporting them, whether it's forensic accountants on their end, forensic engineers, building consultants, could be a handful of different experts depending on the type and nature of the loss. And I think what happens is that for the insured, most of them haven't been through a claim before, but even if they have, it's not something that they do every day. And there's a lot of unknowns with the process. So bringing in somebody to help prepare the claim and having that inherent knowledge from somebody and understanding the process can be quite beneficial to the policyholder themselves. Is just knowing what they need to be doing from a claim perspective, they can really alleviate that burden and help bring some balance to the team. And it really helps make the process very efficient, because then the insurer team, the adjuster and their experts, are getting what they need and what they want in a very timely manner to help the policyholder. And then for the very similar reasons, just knowing what that process entails, and for us, like having been through it literally thousands of times, it's pretty easy for us to help expedite the process and cut to the chase and get to the things that are important. And while we can't change the timeline of repairs and damages and recovery, we can help the claim process along and minimize the time and get to the conclusion faster than without somebody that hasn't been likely through it before. And then lastly, making sure that there is the full economic recovery that somebody is entitled to, or the policyholder is entitled to under the policy. And so you would be surprised how subjective some of the coverages and some of the mechanics of the policy are themselves. And they're all slightly different, and knowing all of the things that somebody's entitled to. If you haven't been through it before, really having somebody along your side to know where to look and to leave no stone uncovered can really help make sure that we have the full economic recovery. And again, and not to make it seem like the adjuster and their team won't help, but the reality of it is it isn't their job to prepare a policyholder's claim. They're by definition or by title alone, adjuster, their job is to adjust the claim that's presented to them. And I haven't seen an adjuster not help a policyholder or give them some guidance, but the reality of it is their model and the way the insurance carriers are structured is those people are handling dozens and dozens of claims likely and processing those. And so again, they're not 100% focused on making sure that the insured has gotten everything that they're entitled to under the policy, and having somebody that has that perspective can really be quite beneficial. So one of the frustrating things about this coverage is the title itself. And it's interesting, if you remember the title slide, it was called Professional Fees and Claim Preparation Expense. And we used that in the title because most people in the insurance industry, when you say that, understand what you're talking about. However, what is frustrating is that the industry and the various carriers and their forms use very different language to describe the same coverage. So unlike, let's say, building, if you say building, is there building coverage, it doesn't matter what form you go to or what carrier, it's going to be listed as building in almost every single form. What's unique about this coverage is, and I'm going to pull up some tiles of the actual language that different carriers use, but as I scroll through these and bring these up, you're going to see that the language and the description is actually quite different between all of them. So what's interesting is I can't tell you how many times we've gotten brokers pulled us into a claim after one of their clients have suffered a loss, and they bring us in and they say, we want to introduce you. Our client needs help, but just so you know, I looked at the form. They don't have coverage for your fees. Say, okay, fine. And then we get a copy of the policy eventually in the process. And sure enough, we just go through the declarations, and the reality of it is it was just labeled something different that person wasn't familiar with. Even some of the most experienced claims professionals at the insurance broker level, sometimes miss this. So I think it's a really important point. And for those purchasing or buying or trying to, get this coverage for their client, one of the things that I will tell you is most carriers and most forms have some sort of coverage under one of these names. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. So now that we know what we're looking for, let's talk about where we would find it in the policy itself. And the most likely place is going to be in the declarations as an additional coverage, using one of the terms that we were showing in the tiles a couple slides ago. So let's look at a few examples. Here's a deck page, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit to make it easier to read. Let me go ahead and highlight this for you, but in this case you'll see they're using the term professional fees, which is one of the tiles that we had. And then over to the right you'll see a dollar amount. In this case $100,000. And later in the session I'll have a slide in regard to talking about how much, but also then next to the dollar amount is the term or phrase annual aggregate. Now this is the only example that I'm aware of, or only policy that I've ever seen where it's referencing an annual aggregate. And every other case that we've ever had, it is usually an occurrence sublimit, meaning you have a loss that occurs in the policy year. You have, in this case, $100,000 available to you for professional fees for that specific claim. In this case, what this is referencing is that this is an annual amount that a policyholder or insured would be entitled to throughout the policy year. So a little bit different, but just wanted to include this as an example because, again, there are nuances and things to be aware of, and I just wanted to highlight some of those unique differences and things that can come up from time to time. Let's go to our next example. This obviously is a Hanover example. Let me zoom in and highlight the relevant section. There we go. So in this case, again, we're on a declarations page, and they're using the term inventory and loss appraisal in this context. And you'll see in the dollar amount included $10,000. What maybe is a little bit different or unique in this example, and why I included it, was there's a column there that says additional amount increase. While even though it says NA, that clearly implies that there might be an opportunity to purchase an amount over and above the standard amount that seems to be included, not only for that coverage, but also the other additional bells and whistles there as well. That said, let's go to our next example. This one is from Chubb. As I zoom in and highlight this example, you'll see that they use the term preparation of loss fees, and the sublimit for this one is $25,000. Let's make our way to the last example. At the bottom, you may notice that this is an ISO form, so you will find this specific language and example with multiple carriers. And I'm going to highlight the inventory and appraisal section. So if you didn't notice, this isn't a declarations page, and we actually had to go through the coverage form itself to look through the additional coverages to find this. In this example, and this is one of the reasons I included this one, is there were no additional coverages listed on the declarations page. So again, we had to go through the details to actually find it. And you will see that over to the right, there is a dollar amount included, just like we had been finding on the deck pages in the past examples. Let me call that out for you. But what I will say is that this isn't unusual to not have it necessarily listed on the deck page itself, but it's also not common. All those examples were focused on finding claim preparation or professional fees within the additional coverages, generally speaking, listed on the declarations. But there's one other place that you can look for the coverage. The other place we found coverage is in an endorsement. So let's go take a look at a few of those examples. So this is clearly an Ironshore form. If you're not familiar, Ironshore is a Liberty Mutual company, but what you'll clearly see is that this is listed as an endorsement, and there's other bells and whistles listed on here, but over to the right you'll see the reference to, in the highlighted section, the professional fees with a sublimit of $50,000. In this example, this is from an excess and surplus carrier called Princeton. Not overly familiar with them, but what you'll see here is another endorsement with several additional coverages listed, one of which is claims expenses with a sublimit of $10,000. But let's look at one that doesn't have a list of additional coverage, which is where it's actually called out separately. In this endorsement, you'll see the title claim data expense, and I believe this is from Amerisure, but regardless, this endorsement is dedicated to the coverage. There aren't any additional coverage listed here, and what you'll see is there's language, or the guiding language that we would normally see buried within a form is actually listed here within the endorsement itself. So now that we know where to find the coverage, let's talk a little bit about what is actually covered. Clearly, it's not a free-for-all, so we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into the scope now. Like the prior section, I'm going to use some real-world examples, but in this case, this is from a Zurich policy. And one point I want to make is that in this example and the next couple that I'm going to share, this is not a snippet of the coverage. This is actually the extent of the language guiding the coverage. And so I think the one point I want to make with that is that there's not a lot of details in these, and there's not a lot of language or specifics. So you can certainly pause this if you'd like to read it in its entirety, but I'm just going to highlight a couple things here and go through some of the language that I think is important, at least in this example. But what you'll see is that it says this covers the actual costs incurred for producing and certifying any details contained in the insured's books or documents or such other proofs, information, or evidence required. And if you think about those words, they're actually fairly vague and generic. Then there's not a lot of specifics in there. And the other thing I would say is that you don't see any highlighted words or bolded words or italicized words, meaning none of those words that are used like certifying and whatnot are not defined anywhere else in the policy. So again, the point being is that they're somewhat vague, but I think all of that goes to the concept of what any of us would do to help the insured, quote unquote, prepare the claim. And again, remember that the burden to prepare and document and support a claim elsewhere in the policy will say that that falls upon the insured to put that together. So again, this is referencing some of that information and what some of those proofs would be required to submit and formalize a claim. So let's look at a couple more examples. So this example is from Travelers, and you're going to see it's very similar, that there's not a lot of words, not a lot of details, not a lot of specifics in this language, and it's fairly limited. I do believe I prefer this one other than the last one. Not that it ever really causes an issue or that we ever have issues, but the one thing I like about this is it again references expenses that you incur, and it says to show the extent of loss. And that's the part that I think really is very succinct with what we do as forensic accountants and claim preparers. We are taking the insured's data and their information and quantifying and creating a document, generally speaking, in the form of Excel files that shows the extent of loss. So I think, again, that matches up really well. And again, not that any of the other languages cause problems, but I think it's very connected to what we do on a daily basis. So this is the last example here. In this case, this is from Hanover. The details here are a little bit smaller, so I'm going to have to zoom in a little bit for this one. As we look at some of the details here, you're going to see the general outline looks very similar to the past examples, similar bullet points and whatnot. But I've highlighted one unique thing that's a little bit different, and frankly, I'm not aware of any care example that carves this out separately. But that first section that I have highlighted there, you'll see that it says that this insurance applies to business personal property. So what they're saying is, if you remember earlier in the session, I was talking about a claim, especially in the context of commercial property, is broader than just business interruption, but that there's building coverage and there's business personal property coverage, which would include contents and possibly inventory. So in this case, this is a limitation to where this coverage for this insured is limited to any claim preparation or professional fees related to just the business personal property section. So if there was a business interruption claim or is help needed with the building claim, this coverage would not apply to that and would only be limited to the business personal property. And so you'll see the language in this case is they're using inventory and loss appraisal. I think that word inventory is very connected to business personal property. When you start thinking about inventory and contents or quantifying the inventory, those are very connected to business personal property. So it makes sense, but I wanted to call out that this is a little bit different and unusual. And again, this isn't something that you would find on the declarations page or possibly in a binder. This is actually buried within the language itself. So if you were to ask for coverage for claim preparation and they'd say, yes, we have this inventory loss appraisal coverage, you would find that it's actually limited to just the business personal property section. Having covered the scope of services that this coverage typically addresses, now let's talk about who it actually covers. And in most cases it's silent, but in some cases it's called out specifically. So I want to address that and talk about some of those examples. So this example is from AIG, and you will probably not find a more detailed policy example where it talks to the who part of this more specifically than this example. There are other carriers with similar language, but this one has quite a bit of detail over and above most other examples. And I'm highlighting the section A, B, and C, and there's 3 general categories here that are listed. But in A, if you do find any specific reference to the who part of it, like I said previously, is that most of the time it's actually not calling anybody out. But in this case, it says your accountants, architects, auditors, engineers, and other professionals. So to the point I was making throughout the session is this claim preparation, professional fees. It's not just a forensic accounting exercise. There may be other professionals that are related, and this speaks very specifically to that. One of the things that's in here that is, I would say, very rare is it actually, in this case, covers the insured's own employees. Now, that by itself can be very generic and vague, like some nuances that you could possibly get into, or that we do get into, is it people preparing the claim and putting it together, just gathering documentation? Is it people involved in talking, who's talking with the adjuster? Is it just hourly folks? Is it just overtime? What about salaried people? As you can imagine, these are all nuances that we typically get into with a claim. But the point being is that it's pretty rare for a policy to cover an insured's employees. The letter C that's actually very rare is, in this case, it's actually providing coverage for the insurance brokers and their subsidiaries and related entities. And presumably this is from probably one of the larger insurance brokers, where they don't have just internal claims advocates or claims people, but they actually have forensic accountants on staff. And so I suspect that this was actually put in there for that reason, to have those people covered in the context where they're helping with the claim. One of the things, though, that all of these policies address, and all the examples, despite them not all speaking to who is included, it almost always talks about who is excluded. And in every example, in every situation, they're always eliminating attorneys and public adjusters. And we can go into the details of why, but I think generally speaking, if you think about what this coverage, again, going back to that very first slide, a couple slides where we're talking about the definition and defining what this is for. Again, this is to get outside help for a policyholder to get help preparing the claim. And once you start talking about attorneys, then you start talking about other things like helping to determine coverage and whatnot, which is different than actually preparing the claim. So in this example, which I believe is from CNA, CNA policy, there isn't any, as I was mentioning before, there isn't any really reference in here to the who specifically is included. But like I said, it does talk about who it's not going to pay for. And again, in this case, you'll see the reference to attorneys and public adjusters. But to the opposite of the last one, this actually very specifically excludes insurance brokers or agents. And I think part of the reason that shows up is it's very common for insurance broker or agent to have somebody representing or helping a policyholder, have somebody helping with the claim process and advocating on their behalf. They may not, and likely not, preparing the quote unquote claim, but because there are people involved that are part of the claim process, I think most carriers try to specifically exclude getting any claim from them. This is just part of their normal services, and not actually preparing the claim, but helping to be a liaison between the policyholder and the carrier. Okay, let me take a quick moment just to recap those points. But the who specifically is usually vague or not even addressed in most policies. The wild card is the insured's employees and or their broker. Again, varies from policy to policy if it is even mentioned. And then lastly, you can almost always count on attorneys and public adjusters being excluded. Let's shift from the coverage details to actually using this coverage in practice. And so the best place to start is when should we get a professional involved or claim preparer involved. And I think the answer we would give is as soon as possible, frankly. And I think part of the reason we say that is, that may defy some common logic. I think a lot of people, when you think about a fire or a hurricane or a flood, whatever it might be, clearly there's some immediate activity and chaos usually ensuing right immediately after the loss. And but the reality of that too is that as soon as the claim is filed, it does spark a flurry of activity from the carrier side. So they're usually responding within 24 hours of being put on notice. And regardless of the activity for recovery for the insured, is the claim process does begin immediately. And for us to be involved with that is very helpful. First of all, while it might be a little premature to start digging into a bunch of documentation and asking a bunch of questions because there's so many unknowns yet into the future, it's good to see some of that activity and what's happening firsthand, because we can save a ton of time down the road. We don't need to come in months later and then rehash all the details. Once things get settled, things become a little bit foggy, and you don't really aren't as clear as to some of the things that had transpired in real time. So it's really good to be part of that early on, but also there is some documentation that is really helpful for the carrier, and being collaborative and cooperative and getting them the information that they need, some of the basic information for making reserve purposes, can pay dividends down the road. So we always say we like to be involved early on and hear the same thing everybody's hearing at the same time. And I do think, having again been through the process thousands of times, one of the benefits for you as a broker, if you're the ones watching this, but one of the things that I think a policyholder finds really helpful for having us involved is we already know what's going to happen. We have a crystal ball. We've seen it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and one of the things that I think we can just bring a little bit of a relief, frankly, knowing and giving a place for them to ask questions. So again, there's a lot of benefits. Best case for us is to get involved ASAP, but what I will say is that it's actually never too late to come in unless a release or the claim has been closed out and a release has been signed. The reality of it is it's really never too late to take that retrospective view. And in fact, a data point that I would give is that more than half of the claims that we get engaged on, we're actually getting involved very later on in the process, without question. So again, it's really never too late. There's always time to go back and review it, and I think that's the norm. But again, perfect world scenario, we would get involved pretty early on in the process. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but like any insurance claim process, this additional coverage doesn't come without some challenges. The good news is they're minimal, and there's really only two. So let's take a dive into those. The first challenge we really deal with is some of these coverages have a couple extra words in them, and frankly this is the bigger of the challenge to overcome, and they're really not a huge deal, and frankly I've never really had an issue working with this or around this, but it does require maybe an extra step or a little bit of a proactive claims approach to overcome this or to avoid an issue down the road. But some of these forms include some extra words and language in there that say when we require, or at our request, or at the request of, and these were included in a couple of examples that I shared earlier in the session, but let me show you a few examples and specifics in this context. Here's three that I have, and the first one is from Traveler, so let me just highlight those details. So if you recall from earlier, they refer to their language, or the term that they use, the title of the coverage is claim data expense. And I'm going to highlight the when we require it language that's included in here. And I think what's frustrating sometimes, or can be the challenge in the process is how this gets applied in practice, or how this gets interpreted in practice. And if you can imagine, clearly this is an additional coverage that is meant to be a quote unquote bell and whistle for the insured. And again, as we talked about earlier, it gives the insured coverage to show the extent of loss and to allow us to come in and provide that assistance. What gets frustrating, I think, is again, sometimes whether it's the policyholder or maybe it's the broker representative letting the adjuster know that we're going to be involved or we're going to be there to help, they get denied because they come back to this language said, well, we didn't require you to do that. And I think, frankly, what's a little bit silly again is this is being offered as an additional bell and whistle or additional coverage, and then it gets taken away because of a couple words in there, which kind of really doesn't make sense, I think, on the surface. So, again, going through this process and that coming up, there's a way to proactively, I think, get ahead of that. But the policy itself, if you just think about what the requirements are, and we won't spend time going through, the duties of the insured and the loss, but essentially what it does require all policies require a policyholder to document, support, and provide the proof of loss or the formal claim. So the policy itself is kind of inherently requiring to show the extent of loss and whatnot, but so it makes it a little bit of a challenge to have this in there, because it could ultimately, we've had adjusters bring it up and use that before as a way to basically avoid the coverage or avoid getting us involved or paying for it at least. In another example here, this is from Selective, I believe, but you'll see that I've highlighted the quote unquote at our request. And again, so all reasonable expenses that you incur at our request. So again, to avoid the, hey, did we request it? What are you actually requesting? The goal is to try and avoid some of that. And again, I come back to some proactive steps that can be taken to try and avoid that as best as possible. Let's look at one more example. So this is an example from EMC, but you'll see the similar at our request language included in there. And I will say that this isn't in every policy, but it's not uncommon. So in a perfect world, this would be dealt with in the placement process or upfront. I realize it's not always necessarily realistic, but it is something to be aware of. But regardless, if it isn't dealt with or it is part of the claims process, I'm going to shift into some guidance to overcome some of those in a little bit here. Before we go into any of that guidance or recommendations or suggestions, I do want to come back to the other challenge or thing that possibly comes up in regard to this coverage. That second issue being a request for a budget for our services. It's not uncommon once an adjuster gets notice or becomes aware that we're going to be assisting the policyholder and helping prepare the claim. It's not in tapping into the professional fees claim preparation coverage. It's not uncommon for them to request a budget for our fees. What is a little bit frustrating is that is not something that is required under any policy. As of the making of this video, there's no coverages out there that has that as a policy requirement. Understandable question, not an unreasonable question, and understand the reason why. However, it is something that frankly is almost impossible for us to answer. And everything we do is on an hourly basis. And the reason that is because this claims process, if we're getting involved, especially early on, there are so many unknowns and so many things out of our control, it's impossible to accurately estimate. So as you can imagine, $100,000 claim requires a much different level of effort than a $10 million claim. And so for that reason, it makes it very difficult for us to predict and estimate what that would look like, 3 months, 6 months into the future. What I would say is, most of these adjusters are very seasoned professionals. They work on claims every single day. They work with forensic accountants and claims preparers every single day. They know and have a really good idea of what to expect and what they can budget on their end to make reserves or whatever they need to do to estimate. So one of the things that we do to get around or try to accommodate that request is to just have a discussion and draw from our experience and tell them what to expect. We as a firm have a policy of not preparing any formal budgets, only because of the reasons I just stated. But again, very happy to cooperate and try and help, whether it's coming from the insured or the adjuster or whoever, to work with them and try and give them some guidance as to what to expect. But regardless, there are ways to deal with both of these issues, and I want to jump into that now. So the best way that we found to avoid these two challenges or issues that come up is to frankly have some communications. And the way we posture it is to what we would call obtaining pre-approval. And the reality of it is, it really is just as simple as basically letting the adjuster know the intentions and trying to get ahead of it before anything would ever come up later down the road. So it requires a very strategic approach to it. And I would say, while I'm going to give you an outline of what the communication would look like, I wouldn't suggest that anybody go and do this on their own before we were ever involved. Like, let us come in and help craft the communication, but just so you have an understanding of how effective this can be, it does, I would say, when this is followed 99% of the time, it actually makes any of these potential challenges completely go away. But generally speaking, what we're suggesting is an email to go either from the insured or from the broker agent representative to the adjuster, saying that, hey, the insured has or is going to retain Pyxis or insert any other claim preparer in there. So it's making them aware of the intentions, and that they're going to be doing X the scope. So you remember earlier from in the session, we were talking about the terms like preparing and certifying and show extent of loss. You're inserting the actual language that the coverage has in there, because you're basically telling them, hey, this is, we're bringing somebody in to do this, and we basically acknowledging that we know we have coverage and purchase coverage to get this help and assistance. Then we like to suggest, putting in there that, hey, we've worked with, so-and-so, whether it's adjuster or this carrier in the past. You'd be very hard pressed to find a property insurance carrier or cyber carrier and builder's risk carrier that we haven't worked or done claims with or for in the past. So we always like to include that in there, because I think it not disarms, but there's some familiarity that this isn't our first time with this carrier or using this getting paid under this language. And then basically tell them that, our intention again is to submit our costs, or from the policyholder, submit Pyxis costs for reimbursement under this coverage. So it's basically putting the onus and burden on the adjuster to say something now, basically. If they have any questions or if they have any issues with this, they need to bring it up. And again, 99% of the time when we have these proactive emails go out, that there's never any issues. And this is different than what I think, and this is an important point, this is different than what the norm is. The norm for a lot of, especially on the broker side, is to say, hey, I'm going to ask the adjuster if we can bring Pyxis in. And this is slightly different. This is actually almost telling them that we're going to bring Pixis in, and that we know that we have coverage and that we're going to use it, which is different than asking or saying that. It's their policy, it's their claim, and it's their loss. And the analogy I like to use is the insured's free to use whoever they want for this service, and it's no different than a building being damaged or destroyed and hiring a contractor. The carrier doesn't decide what contractor the insured would use. Now, they have a say in how much it is to repair or replace, but they don't dictate or even suggest necessarily what contractors to use. And this is no different. So this follows the same lines. I want to shift gears and talk about the sublimits themselves now. And if you remember from earlier on in our session here, we were pulling up a bunch of examples from the declarations page that were showing the sublimits. And from our perspective, the ones that we see most common, meaning the sublimits that come standard in the forms, are generally speaking ranging between $5,000 and $100,000. So that's without question the most common. I think the one that we see the most standard is $25,000. Like, you can have a big range, but that's where most of them fall in, and 25,000 being the most common one. I will say though that we've seen them be up to $5 million. And in fact, I was actually part of a claim where that limit actually was exceeded. Now, this was a very significant $300 million plus loss, and there were quite a few experts involved. It wasn't just forensic accounting, it was architects and engineers and building consultants and whatnot, but the limit was actually exceeded. Clearly that's not common in the scope of a claim, and loss of that size is quite significant. But I just wanted to make the point that this can range dramatically. And in the next slide, I will talk a little bit about trying to help narrow that down and define maybe needs and how much. But I will also say it's very, very rare, but there are scenarios where I have seen this coverage be unlimited. Again, not common, very rare, but I have seen it. Well, now that we've gotten through all of that, the obvious question that we typically get from most people is, well, this is great, this sounds awesome, but how much coverage should I be getting for my client, or if I'm a policyholder, how much do I need? And I think it's really a hard question to answer in a short session like this. But if there's some basic guidance I could offer, is to consider the potential losses itself. And if you're talking about apartment complexes, that's drastically different than a global manufacturer with a 500,000 square feet facility. Two drastically different potential scope. So the needs for those are just drastically different. So you have to consider the extent and potential scope of losses. So again, without having one-off conversations or talking about any specific loss, I think that's really what drives the needs, is the potential losses themselves. What I can offer is maybe a best practice, without again going into specifics of any given exposure. But when we talked about that range of the 5,000 to the 100,000 kind of being the standard amounts that some of the carriers throw in there, one of the things that you can ask, and I've heard several producers on the broker side mention this, but if, let's say the standards being thrown in there of $25,000, from what I understand, just asking to increase that. So maybe instead of 25, you just ask for that to be bumped up to 50,000. From what I understand, it's always a throw-in. It's such a small component of the broader property insurance coverage. It really is nothing in just a a small blip on the radar in the grand scheme of the coverage. So just asking for more, again, I always hear that usually isn't an issue. So maybe as a best practice, again, without going into the weeds of detail, is to just generally speaking make it part of your best practices to just ask for more. And I will say most of the standard coverages in the real world are actually pretty sufficient. Not always, but are pretty sufficient to cover most losses. But when you start talking about, $1 million losses, you go 2 million to 5 million to 10 million, those could take up quite a bit of time and effort. So just keep that in mind. Well, that concludes everything I had to cover for our session, and I hope you found it insightful. I think most probably realize that there's actually a little bit more to this coverage than you might think on the surface, but by all means, if anything comes up or there's any questions that we didn't address, or you have a specific scenario that you want to connect on separately, together, I have my contact information there. You're free to reach out to me anytime, and I'd be happy to connect. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and if you have any feedback, feel free to send it my way. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.